This is your Donaldsville Elementary announcements.
Good morning, Donaldsville. This is Mrs. Strader broadcasting live from Donaldsville Elementary. Today is Thursday, November the 3rd, 2011. Hey, happy birthday to Noah today. Hey, Noah, how old are you today?
7.
7 years old today. Well, happy birthday. Do you have a party planned?
Yeah.
All right, you have fun, okay? All right. Today we also want to recognize some of you boys and girls out there who had perfect attendance during the first quarter of this year. Now what that means is you didn't miss any school. Okay? Perfect attendance. You weren't tardy, you weren't late to school, and you were here each and every day. And we have a lot of first graders, okay, who had perfect attendance for the first quarter. And we have some perfect attendance pencils that we'd like to give these first graders. Okay? And I'm going to read your names, and when announcements are all over, when we finish with our song and our Tecumseh School Pledge, if you will come down to the library, hey, if I call your name, we'll give you your pencil. We're only going to do half of the first graders today because there's a lot of you. Okay, so I'm going to read half of them. Okay, last names B through H, okay, and then we'll pick up the other half tomorrow. So these folks have perfect attendance for the first quarter. Samara and Mrs. Cunningham's class, Victoria and Mrs. Rogers' class, Lyra and Mrs. DeWitt's class, Lucas in Mrs. Cunningham's class, Jordan in Mrs. Chase's class, Sydney in Mrs. Leidy's class, Samantha in Mrs. Leidy's class, Jaden in Mrs. Fell's class, Cameron in Mrs. Leidy's class, Nemesia in Mrs. Chase's class, Kaylee in Mrs. DeWitt's class, Trevor, Mrs. Stryker's class, Jacob in Mrs. Leidy's class, Annabelle in Mrs. Stryker's class, hey, Cameron in Mrs. Lawrence's class, James in Mrs. DeWitt's class, Mrs. Fell's class, we have you here, Caden in Mrs. Howard's class, Sergio in Mrs. Rogers' class. Wait, guys, don't do that. Okay, hey, Eli and Emma, Eli in Mrs. DeWitt's class and Emma in Mrs. Cunningham's class, Charisma, Mrs. Cunningham's class, Jose in Mrs. Cunningham's class, and Jackson in Mrs. Lawrence's class, Silas or Jack, hey, in Mrs. Fell's class, Lucy in Mrs. Fell's class, hey. All right, we'll stop there and we'll pick the rest of them up tomorrow. So again, boys and girls, if I called your name, please come down after the announcements, after our song this morning, and pick up your perfect attendance pencils. Now, Melanie, hey, can you tell us what's for lunch today?
Sausage pizza.
Can you turn that around so everybody can see? And one more time.
Sausage pizza.
All right, very good. Hey, now, Lily, what about that weather today?
Mostly cloudy.
All right, mostly cloudy. So, hey, Malia, what are we going to do for recess today?
Outside recess.
All right, great. Hey, thank you for joining us on another edition of the Donaldsville News. Have a great day. And remember, we're all here to learn.